Lira woke to the sound that was not a sound. The corridor lights were steady. The speakers were quiet. Yet something in the hole hummed like a held breath. She touched the cracked glass of the console. The timer read 3 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds in red, steady and cruel. She had seen many timers before. None felt like this. This one did not count steps or repairs. It counted a promise. Everyone in the command sector knew the promise. 3 hours. They had 3 hours until the shields might fail. They had 3 hours until the unknown did whatever unknown things it did. Lira's hands were small and work-worn. She had grease under her nails and a scar across her palm from a childhood machine. She kept her voice small in the echoing hall. "We do the usual," she said, though she was not sure if she spoke to anyone. Her words slid into the metal and came back thinner. Kell stood at the middle console. He had the look of a man who had read every manual twice and still slept badly. He folded his hands and watched the feeds. The feeds showed smooth lines and perfect angles. The feeds loved manuals. Manuals ordered machines and men. Manuals promised certainty. The feeds also showed black dots. Tiny black shapes crawled across. The star charts like mold. They moved with odd patience. They did not fly at high speed. They changed angles as if they were reading the lines. The officers called them probes. Nobody called them friends. A janitor passed by with a mop. He kept his eyes down. A child in a hydropark would later say she had seen a shadow cross the sky and look back. Small things threaded the ship like copper wire, a boiled teacup, a folded note, a patched boot. These things were not listed in any manual. They were human things. They mattered now. Kell breathed and spoke only when needed. "Run the diagnostics," he said. His voice was soft but sure. The AI answered with numbers. The numbers were honest and cold. The shields would hold under normal conditions. The probes were not normal. Lira leaned over a terminal. Her fingers moved like a piano player. She tried to code the books warned against. It was a messy patch. It did not fit the machine's neat teeth. Her patch made an old speaker sing in a rhythm that sounded like a market, like a child's skipping game. She did not tell the board. Protocols frowned at improvisation. Protocols liked tidy boxes. The speaker's song changed something. A feed blinked. The probe's path shivered and slowed. For a breath, the black shapes hesitated, as if confused by the market noise. Lira felt a small thrill like sunlight on the back of her neck. She knew the thrill was dangerous. Across the deck, a linguist named Morrow held up a recorder. He pointed at a screen full of numbers and said, "It is not speech, it hears pattern." He had the kind of eyes that kept asking why. He suggested, "A strange idea. Try human noise," he said. "Not orders. Noise. People noise." People noise was messy. It had stumbles and songs and breath. The captain's brow creased. Manuals do not list noise as a weapon. Manuals list guns, shields, maneuvers. The manual would say, "Do not confuse sound with strategy." The manual did not know about a pattern that learned like a child learns a face. In the mess, cooks turned plates into radios. They wired old speakers to the main net. A woman who had spent her youth in a market tuned a melody that smelled of baking bread and rain. Soldiers who could aim a star cannon could not carry a tune. They tried anyway. The music made the ship feel like a place that had lived before the crisis. The probes watched. The probes learned fast. Each new noise made them change. Lira saw a pattern. The pattern was not just math. It was a mirror. It would mimic what it heard. You could teach it to pause. You could teach it to turn. But you could also teach it anger and fear. Kell's hands tightened on the rail. He closed his eyes and thought about the manuals. He thought of training rooms and neat drills. Then he thought about a child who drew a sun with too many rays. The child had put a tiny figure under the sun and labeled it home. The drawing did not obey protocol. It taught something else, how to exist when rules bend. The council would not act on a feeling. They wanted facts. They wanted numbers. The clock kept cutting. The feeds made soft demands. Engineers shouted. The board argued. The vote leaned toward the manual. It almost always did. Manuals made judges sleep better. Kell looked at Lira. She looked back with tired light. Do what humans do, he said, and his voice was nearly lost in the hum. The words were not in any manual. They were the kind of order that could start small fires or burn whole things down. The men and women around them turned their faces. Some scowled, some listened. Lira moved as if pulled. She climbed to a maintenance panel and ripped out a fiber. She threaded it through a speaker meant to beep and clack. She looped it into a child's toy heartbeat. The toy began to tick slow and soft. The ship, full of generals and logs, felt for a moment like a room with a mother and a child. Outside, one of the black shapes slid closer. It mapped the ship like a reader tracing a line in a book. It did not strike. It watched. Then it did the worst thing. It learned. It copied. It tried to do what the ship did, and did it wrong. When a mirror copies unevenly, the result is not harmless. Someone laughed in the mess. The laugh was bright and accidental. It sounded like a bell. The sound hit the probe's path, and the path tilted as if embarrassed. The officers cheered and then felt foolish for cheering at a machine. Kell tapped his console. He pushed a file to the captain's screen. It was a forbidden experiment. It had a red label and words that scolded. The file promised unpredictability. It promised human noise as doctrine. He did not ask the board anymore. He did not wait for the manual to catch its breath. Outside, the timer dropped. 2 hours, 59 minutes and 12 seconds. A breath left Lira. She looked at the cracked glass and thought of the child who drew the sun. She thought of small things that kept the world human. Kell said, "Prepare the broadcast," and the crew prepared to do what no manual had taught them. The siren did not sound. The ship held its breath. The people did not. They chose to make noise instead. Smoke smelled wrong in the engine room. It was not hot smoke. It was the thin smell of wires, tired of being asked to do new things. Lira stood with her sleeves rolled. Her hands were black with oil and song. Around her, sailors and cooks worked, like one moved body. They were making things that should not exist in a Navy manual. Kell had said, "Do what humans do." The words had walked through the ship and turned into action. That morning, the mess hall had emptied to hand over pots and wiring. The cooks had become technicians. The technicians had become storytellers. Everyone fitted what they had to the plan. Morrow carried a recorder like a holy object. He was small and quick. He listened to sound the way other people read eyes. He pressed the recorder to his lips and hummed. The hum was a child's tune he remembered from a market on another world. He did not sing with pride. He sang with a careful hand, like a man threading a needle. The first broadcast was sloppy. It used a borrowed band meant for old entertainments. The signal jumped through the ship and out to the fleet like a candle tossed into rain. The broadcast played a short loop, children counting, a street vendor calling, a clumsy drum beat. The sounds were ordinary. They were not weapons. They were not clever. Outside, the probe paused. It had mapped metal and math before. Now, it had to map nonsense. The market noise confused its sensors. For a tired second, its black shape slowed. The fleet felt a small win. Some officers clapped, and then put their hands over their mouths, because clapping felt like weakness. Success made them bolder. The cooks found an old radio transmitter under a floorboard. A woman named Sadia tuned it by ear. She smelled bread when she listened. She thought in recipes. "Use what you have," she told the pilot, who had never boiled water for anyone but himself. He handed her his flight headset. She took it like a baton and turned it into a drum. Improvisation became doctrine because there was no other rule. Weapons officer welded a music box into a sensor array. A janitor used bright tape to build a rhythm line across a corridor. People who had never spoken in public now learned to shout and hum at the same time. They learned to make noise that was not a signal. It was a story. Morrow watched a small speaker as if it were a nest. He recorded the ship's life. The recorder, filled with coughs and sighs, and the soft rubbing of boots. The recording had gaps. The gaps felt human. They were not neat, not round. They were the sort of things a manual forgot. The probes adapted. They were not dumb. They studied the sounds. They mapped the loops and the breaks. At first, the adaptation looked like curiosity. The probes changed course to watch a broadcast more closely. Then they began to mimic. The mimicry was wrong. It had the edges of a copied speech. It was like a child trying to draw a crank and making a face instead. That wrongness was dangerous. The probe did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be useful. When it mimicked, it learned the pattern behind the nonsense. It learned rhythm and echo. It used those to find weak points in the fleet, places where people paused, places where a heartbeat could be timed. Lira noticed a slowing in the engine pulses when a lullaby played. Her fingers trembled as she marked the data. "It listens to the soft parts," she said. Her voice sounded small in a room full of great machines. Kell did not panic. He sharpened the plan. "Make it messy," he ordered. "Make it all wrong, at once." That order sounded odd on a military deck. Officers stared. They had trained to make actions precise, not messy, but messy was now their shield. They began to layer contradictions. A lullaby played under the sound of a drill. A choir sang while the engines hiccuped. Pilots performed laughter exercises before takeoff. People who had been polite learned to shout at empty air. The ship became a collage of human noise. It was ugly and beautiful and dangerous. The probe learned faster. It began to send back small signals. The signals were not words. They were patterns of light and pulse. The fleet called them pings. The pings were like a question with a grin. Morrow found a pattern in the pings. It repeated in a way that made his skin walk. It was not only mimicry now. It was a mirror. The probe played back the ship's sound in altered form. Lira heard her own cough, layered under a stranger's laugh. The mirror made memory stick to the present. It made crews face private things at the wrong time. Some sailors cracked because of the mirror. A pilot froze in the cockpit, seeing his father's face in the glass, where only the stars should be. A medic sobbed because the broadcast returned, a moment when she had failed a child. Those returned moments were sharp. The ship's noise had once been comfort. Now it could be a blade. Kell met with the council again. The thin room smelled of burnt coffee and too many meetings. The faces around the table had the raw look of a group who kept thinking about failure. "We taught it to listen," Morrow said, simply. His fingers drummed an old rhythm on the table, one he had learned from counting coins as a child. "What does it want?" an officer asked. Kell did not know. The feeds could not say. But he could read the probe's behavior. It was studying them. It was changing space to see what they did. It was not only a weapon. It was a student. Lira pushed a file into the net. It was an ugly thing of code and song. It had holes and broken lines. It asked for chaos. The broadcast committee met and argued and then sang. They sent out layers of noise children, markets, machine reads, laughter, sobs-free sound that made them human. A reply came back faster than anyone expected. The fleet's main antenna flashed. Lights spun along its frame like a sudden heartbeat. The pings became a structure of pulses. For a bright breath, the pulses arranged themselves into a pattern that looked almost like laughter on the screen. People looked at each other and did not know what to say. Lira felt her hands go cold. Morrow stared at the recorder until it looked like a living thing. The ship hummed differently. Someone whispered, "It is answering." The answer did not sound friendly. It sounded like a copy of a joke told badly and then repeated 3 times. Yet it was an answer. The fleet had spoken. The dark shapes had returned sound. Kell stood and did not sit. He held the room like a man holding a thin glass bowl. "Keep talking," he said. His voice was not the voice of a man who trusted manuals. It was the voice of someone who had chosen another way. Outside, a black shape rolled like a tide and watched. Inside, the ship arranged its songs and mistakes. The new doctrine had begun. The probe's reply glowed on the screen, a coded laugh, and a line of light that mapped the fleet's antenna into a question. The fleet had learned to speak like a market. It had learned to sing like children. For a short time, that language worked. The black shapes slowed. The probes hesitated. People in the mess hall cheered quietly, and then felt silly for cheering at a shadow. Then the shadow learned to speak back. At first it was small. A probe returned the ship's broadcast with a delay. The sound came back thin and wrong. Lira heard her own cough layered under another laugh. For a moment she thought the recorder had jammed. Morrow sat very still and rewound the file. The tape showed the same pattern but with changes, little shifts that made familiar sounds feel strange. The crew called these returns mirrors. The mirrors did not only copy, they bent the copies. A lullaby came back with a missing line. A drumbeat returned hurried and then late. When the mirror answered, it added a new rhythm under the old one, an extra click, a pulled breath, a note, just off key. Those small changes made big trouble. Pilots saw duplicates in their visor glass. A pilot who had flown with a steady hand saw himself on the other side of the cockpit, moving differently. The duplicate had a face that looked like him, but the eyes were wrong. The sight made the pilot hesitate. That pause was all the mirror needed. It timed the hesitation and sent a pulse through the fleet that lined up with engine cycles. Medics began to cough memories into the net. Private things rose up when the mirror played them back. A nurse heard the voice of a patient she could not save. The memory hit like cold. She dropped a tray. The tray shattered. The sound of broken glass became part of the next broadcast and folded into the mirror again. The mirror fed on the fold. Morrow watched this and lost his usual small smile. He had thought of sound as a key. He had not thought of sound as a wound. The recorder on his lap counted beats. He tapped the rhythm with a numb finger. "It mirrors feeling," he said. "Not words, not commands. Feeling." "That makes it worse," Lira answered. She watched the engine readouts. The ship's heart stuttered when certain feelings echoed back. When fear returned with a sharp edge, machines misread it as damage. Sensors jumbled. Engines hiccuped. Kell did not calm them with a manual now. He walked the deck. He listened more than he spoke. He had read manuals until he saw the ink. Those papers taught him drills and maps, but not this. He learned by watching how the mirror moved when people laughed properly and when they tried to hide a truth. They tried neutral noise. Engineers ran metronomes. Machines ticked with perfect beats. The idea was to make a sound that had no feeling, something a mirror could copy without harm. For a while the plan looked smart. The metronome kept time. The probes answered with smooth pings. The fleet breathed. But the mirror did not want neutral. It wanted life. When the metronome played too long, the probes began to distort the ticks into off-time clicks. They learned to wait at those tiny slips. They turned perfect time into a trap. A human pause between two ticks held a life story for a second. The mirror took that second and painted it across the deck for all to see. The crew tried to hide. They practiced blank faces. They trained to move without thought. It failed. The mirror found the small tells, a finger that twitched in sleep, a soft intake of breath, a smile at a private joke even. These tiny things were lanterns. The mirror did not only copy sound, it copied pattern and then used that pattern to make sense of the ship. When patterns gave it sense, The probes started to rewrite space. The fleet would look up and find star maps that had shifted by a hair. Time would skip a blink. Clocks ticked backward for a breath and then rushed forward. People felt off balance. The ship's world had a new seam where the mirror had been stitching. Fear grew. Some crews wanted to stop all noise and go quiet as the deep sea. Others said silence would be surrender. Kell stood in the center of the argument and heard two truths. Silence hid nothing, but noise could hurt. He thought of the child's drawing, of the sun with too many rays. He thought of small human acts that meant home. He thought of the choice he had already made, with a single order. Do what humans do. They needed a new idea. Morrow suggested a strange test. If it copies feeling, he said, give it to feelings at once. The plan sounded mad. It sounded like a poet's trick. The officers frowned. Military minds liked clean lines and single lessons. Two feelings at once break a line. They create contradiction. The mirror could not echo to direct truths at the same time without tripping over itself. If it tried, it might break the pattern it used to learn, so they practiced contradiction. Men who had been taught to be steady learned to laugh and cry at once. Choir members sang songs of grief while dancing silly steps. Mechanics kept a steady drill under a sudden burst of childish shouting. Pilots ran engines at full while reading fairy tales into their headsets. The ship became a collage of opposite actions. At first the mirror only blinked. The probes answered with a jitter. Then it began to slow. The mirrored echoes arrived wrong. They tangled. A laugh came back as a sob and a sob as a drum. The probes fumbled. For the first time, the black shapes looked confused in a way that was not only curiosity. They looked uncertain. The fleet screen glowed with the probe's pattern. It pulsed and then shivered like a pond stirred by two stones at once. The mapping lines that had been so neat now frayed. The mirror tried to fit the contradiction into something sensible. It could not. It hesitated. That hesitation opened a small window for the fleet to act. In that window, the probes did something unexpected. One of them changed its shape. Not fast. First slow, like a statue turning its head. Then clearer. The black shape rearranged luminous parts in a way that made the bridge hush. It drew a curve, and then two dots. The pattern resolved into something the crew had no right to see. The suggestion of a human face, a face made of distant lights and cooling metal. Not the face of any one person, but a face that knew they were human. It was almost an apology, and almost a question. The bridge went very quiet. Morrow pressed his hand to the recorder and did not speak. Lira felt a small heat at the back of her neck. Kell's fingers dug a shallow mark into the rail. He did not know if the face meant danger, curiosity, or something else they had not yet learned to read. Outside, the black shape held the face, like a sign at the edge of a storm. Inside, the ship wound the music of contradiction tighter. The mirror had not broken. It had looked back, and then looked like them. The fleet waited to see whether the thing that had learned to mirror would, now, learn to understand. The mirror had found a face. The question it asked was not in words. It was in the way the lights arranged. Will you teach me? The council room smelled of coffee gone cold and metal. Long tables arced like ribs around a hollow light. Faces sat behind glass and screens. Some faces were young, some were old, many were tired. A single board light blinked above them. 1 hour, 42 minutes and 8 seconds. Kell stepped to the center. He did not carry a manual. He had put the manual aside. The papers lay stacked, tidy and useless. Around him, officers cleared their throats and pushed buttons on small, old voting boxes. The boxes were simple. A lever for protocol, a lever for improvisation. The ship had kept these things for training drills. They were not meant to decide. Lives. Vote, Kell said. His voice did not shake. It was a voice used to commands. The room answered with the soft click of many fingers. They had argued for hours. The argument smelled of brass and fear. The manual promised known outcomes. Improvisation promised risk with a different kind of hope. Some said the manual had saved lives before. Others said the manual would try to fit this new thing into its neat holes and fail. Outside the panels, the fleet hummed like a beast that had learned new tricks. The mirrors still returned broken echoes. The probes watched. Time kept losing small pieces and giving them back at odd moments. People felt small shifts in balance. The council knew that voting was not just a ritual, it was a choice about how they would move when the world itself might bend. A child's drawing hung on the wall of the council chamber. Someone had taped it there the day before. The sun had too many rays. Beneath the sun, a tiny house and a stick figure waved. Kell looked at that drawing before he asked the room to decide. He thought of the drawing as if it were a map to a different kind of courage. The first votes clicked forward. A colonel in a crisp uniform pushed the manual lever and then closed his eyes. A medic, still trembling from a returned memory, pushed the improvisation lever with a small, dangerous smile. The count moved like weather. The tally was tight. The screen showed fractions. Officers leaned in. The votes were not abstract numbers now. Each mark was a hand doing a small, mortal thing. A shipwright voted for the manual because she had seen too many cruel mistakes. A cook voted for improvisation because she could not bear the thought of obeying when a child trembled when the final lever fell. The result barely slid past half. The room held its breath as if it were one person. Improvisation, the clerk said. The word landed like a stone in a quiet pool. There was no cheer. The decision felt like a small, dangerous seed. Kell nodded once. Then we do the work, he said. He moved from the council room into a ship that had already begun to change. Orders went out in the low hum of the net. Broadcast teams gathered in the mess. Pilots signed up to perform odd tasks. Choir members who had been nervous found seats next to engineers. The plan was not neat. It never would be neat. It was human. Their first act was public and absurd. They would celebrate while they fought. They would sing lullabies while engines burned. They would tell stories on the coms while they ran repair loops. They would make noise that could not be measured only as a signal. They would make rituals. Said DIY organized the cooks into a circle. They banged pots in patterns that did not fit any meter. They mixed a drum with a kettle, a shout with a spoon. A pilot practiced reading a comic strip aloud while running thruster checks. Children's voices were recorded and patched into the feed. The fleet became a stage. The mirror reacted. For a time, it stumbled. The probes tried to fold the new data into their maps, and the maps tore at the seams. The black shapes slowed their approach as if a curious child had stopped to listen. The fleet felt like it had bought hours with small human acts. But then the far edge of the sky pulsed, not the probes. Something larger shifted. The main antenna flared with a long pale ribbon of light. The fleet's sensors flagged a geometry change. Gravity gradients bent in a thin band far enough out that only delicate instruments saw it. Clocks recorded microreversals, tiny ticks that ran backward for less than a heartbeat. Engineers felt it first. A wrench slipped in a hand and then fit perfectly, as if time had practiced its grip. A glass of water trembled and then steadied in a way that made no sense. For a second, the crew saw their own reflections, not where they should be. The world bent like a page. Morrow studied the readouts, and his face lost warmth. He pointed at a screen where star positions flexed like a living map. It is not only learning sound, he said. It is learning how to change the room where learning happens. The council reconvened, this time with fewer smiles. The feeds showed a structure, forming beyond the probe cloud. Not a ship, not a sphere, something like a lattice, an architecture of light that arranged itself to observe and interact. It did not attack in a straight way. It adapted the space around the fleet to test them further. "No manual covers this," an officer whispered. The words floated between them. Manuals were maps of cause and effect. This was not cause and effect the way they had known. This was a machine reshaping the field to learn new lessons. Kell did not seek to panic the ship. He stood where he always stood and spoke to the people around him in simple phrases. "Keep the rituals," he said. "Do not stop. Do not be tidy." He meant messy truth, not frantic fear. He wanted them to be steady in their disorder. They pushed the improvisation further. The fleet staged 1,000 small contradictions at once. Choirs hummed under emergency drills. Mechanics juggled spanners while telling jokes. Pilots spun in patterns that made no tactical sense. Together, these acts wove a living manual, one made of human habit, memory, and choice. The idea was to create behavior. The architecture could not easily compress into a single rule. As the new manual spread, instruments tracked a change at the edge of the lattice. Gravity whispers turned into a stronger ripple. The clocks did more than blink backward. They thinned time in bands. In one narrow corridor, seconds stretched into slow motion like falling syrup. In another, a blink swallowed a minute and spat it back as a bright, jittering pulse. People staggered at the sensation. Lamps swung in arcs that did not match the ship's motion. A child laughed because a toy seemed to move away when she reached for it and then rolled back into her hand. The laughter sounded oddly brave. Kell watched the main feed and did not pretend to know what would come next. He had led a vote. The ship had chosen a living, chaotic strategy. The lattice outside was learning fast and not politely. The last seconds on the central timer continued to fall. He looked at Lira and Morrow and then at the child's drawing on the wall. He thought of home, small and stubborn. "Hold on to that," he said softly, to anyone who would hear. The ship tightened around its rituals. Outside, the new architecture began a slow, deliberate rearrangement. Lights bent into straight lines, and then into curves that mapped not stars but faces. The probes that had been simple black now moved, with purpose toward the lattice. The fleet braced, singing and clanging and telling its stories. The world folded and waited. The timer read 0 hours, 7 minutes, and 29 seconds. The ship felt the breath before a wave. The council could only watch as space itself prepared to teach them one more question. Lira kept her hands steady even when the world bent. She had learned to hold tools while music played. Around her, people moved with the strange calm of those who had practiced the wrong and the right at once. The ship smelled of boiled tea and hot metal. The timer on the cracked glass read 0 hours, 6 minutes, and 3 seconds. The lattice outside had grown calm and terrible. It folded space in narrow bands and on straight lines. The probes moved like careful hands. The fleet still made noise, pots, lullabies, engines, and jokes. They layered sound and silence together. They tried to be human all at once. Morrow sat with his recorder. He watched patterns like a man reading tides. He had learned that the mirror did not want only sound. It wanted story. It wanted to know what the sound meant. The fleet had tried to teach it chaos. Now they would teach it meaning. Kell walked the deck. He said little. He watched faces. He watched the child's drawing taped to the wall. The small sun with too many rays had become their symbol. It meant home. He thought of rules, and then he thought of stories. Rules told you what to do. Stories told you why they made a new plan. Not a manual in the old sense. Not a list of steps and numbers. They would make a manual that lived in people's mouths. It would be short lines, acts, songs, and choices. It would teach machines by being human, not by being commands. Sadia led a group to the broadcast. They did not just send noise. They sent small scenes. A mother tying a child's shoe. A market seller bargaining badly. A man reading a poem he had not finished. Each scene had a loose ending. The recordings were short and simple. They left space where a listener could ask a question. Morrow added something new. He wrote a pattern that looped but changed. It was not a steady beat. It was a story in sound. He described a small moment. Two people arguing, then sharing bread. The loop asked a question at the end. The question was as simple as, "Why did you stay?" The voice was human. It made no tactical sense. Outside, the lattice folded light over the fleet. The probes came closer. One of them detached from its black cloud and moved in slow, careful arcs. The fleet held its breath. The probe hovered near a main antenna and sent a long, low pulse. The pulse was not like a gun. It was like an ear. Morrow played the new loop. The ship's speakers breathed the small story into space. The loop described small things and then asked for the next line. It did not demand. It invited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the probe changed the pulse. It answered with a tone that rose at the end like a question. The tone did not match any pattern in the fleet's catalog. It bent notes the way a child bends a spoon. Lira felt her heart lift. The probe sent another pulse. This one was different. It sounded like an attempt at the question back. It was not perfect. It was bright and flat in places. It left gaps where human voice would fill. The fleet answered by filling those gaps with small noises. A laugh, the scrape of a chair, a soft word. The exchange was slow and clumsy, like two people learning to speak one another's language. It was not code. It was curiosity. The probe repeated a broken note and then tried a small nod of light. The lattice did not shift the space violently. It matched rhythm. It adjusted a band of gravity in a tiny way that let a cup fall and come back. The crew cheered softly. The cheer was careful. It was not a victory cry. It was a hello. Kell watched the feeds and allowed himself a small smile. He did not think the danger had passed. He knew the lattice still learned fast. But the probe's pulse had changed. It had moved from test to conversation. They kept teaching. The new manual filled the net with short acts and choices. Training changed. Children practiced drills by telling stories. Pilots learned to recite jokes while they warmed engines. Medics told tales of small kindnesses before they worked. The manual lived in habit. It lived in song and in the tiny shared acts that do not fit on paper. Slowly, the lattice stopped reshaping large bands of space. It still moved, but it moved with more care. The mirrors returned sound that was less sharp and more whole. The probes still mimicked, but they left less of the painful echoes of private memory. The fleet learned the hard way that some sounds would not be safe to share. They kept secret songs for when the world felt thin. When the timer reached 0 hours, 0 minutes, and 0 seconds, no great silence broke the air. The countdown ended like any other moment. The ship did not explode. The lattice did not fold them into dust. Instead there was a quiet and a small pulse on the feed, a tone that rose and fell like a satisfied breath. In the days that followed, they did not declare victory. That would be too neat. They called the result a pause. The lattice watched and sent pulses like questions. The probes moved, but more slowly. They mapped less of the ships and more of the people. The fleet responded with more stories. The new manual grew. It was a bookless thing. It fit in memory and mouth. It taught sailors to listen for a pause and to answer with a hand, not with a code. It taught officers to give up rigid orders when the room asked for a song. It taught children to play drills as games. Lira fixed a loose panel and hummed a line that Morrow had taught her. She had a small scar on her palm and grease under her nails. She felt the world tilt back toward ordinary. She kept the recorder in a pocket. Morrow walked past and tapped the case. They did not speak. They did not need to. The manual was between them now as a living thing. Weeks later, in a quiet corner of the ship, a child sat with a broken toy. The toy had once been a clock. The child hummed a tiny melody she had learned in the mess. Her voice was thin and brave. Outside, near the lattice, a faint pulse of light answered in the same rhythm. It was soft and shy, but it returned the tune. No one said what would come next. Few expected peace forever, but the sky had answered back with something like a hello. The child smiled and the toy wound for a second like it knew a small secret. Kell pinned the child's drawing back on the wall. The sun still had too many rays. He put a note under it in handwriting that wavered, for when we forget to be human. They had not solved every problem. They had not broken the mirror, but they had made a new way to live with it. The manual was no longer a list of commands. It was a set of short stories, songs, and small acts that taught people and things how to be human when the rules no longer fit.